I would like to invite you to join us for our ICF virtual conference called The Voyage Continues, July 23 through 25 later this summer, beginning at 6 p.m. London time each day. Friday will be devoted to our commemoration of the voyage of the Mayflower 400 years ago. Saturday will be devoted to other Mayflower stories. How did Congregationalism come to the various parts of the world outside of Britain and the United States? Sunday will be devoted to COVID stories from our churches around the world and a collective worship service reaching all the way around the globe. I hope you will be able to join us. To register for this free conference, please go to www.theicf.org.
Hello everyone, I am Janet Wootton, co-chair of the International Congregational Theological Commission, and I'm interviewing Professor Charles Hambrick Stowe, one of the speakers at the conference of the International Congregational Fellowship on the 23rd to 25th of July this year. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you very much, Janet, and it's a real pleasure to be able to participate in this international conference.
It's good to have you with us. Could you introduce yourself and tell us how you come to have an interest in the Mayflower Pilgrims?
That is really a question related to the story of my life. I was in college and took a course in American intellectual history, and that's where I first read Perry Miller and the Pilgrims and was really introduced to this great legacy. And when I was in seminary, had the pleasure of being a research assistant to the church history professor, John von Rohr, and was able to read on microfilm the writings of John Robinson and William Ames and Thomas Hooker and other luminaries in the Puritan and Pilgrim tradition. So that when it came time to doing a PhD, which I did at Boston University with David Hall, whose well-known book, The Faithful Shepherd, really led me there. I was really ready to focus on the spiritual life, the devotional life of the Pilgrims, and was able to have my dissertation published as The Practice of Piety, Puritan Devotional Disciplines in 17th Century New England, University of North Carolina Press, and then subsequently Early New England Meditative Poetry, Ann Bradstreet and Edward Taylor with Paulus Press in their Spirituality series, and have written articles over the years and taught in various seminaries, and more recently have really, for almost the last 20 years, done a lot of work on Jonathan Edwards, and just recently, still warm, if not hot off the press, the Oxford Handbook of Jonathan Edwards. And I have a piece on Edwards's spiritual experience and devotional life. So this theme that I'm pursuing really has been a lifelong interest. And of course, 1620, 1621 is just a wonderful opportunity to bring some focus my work on now the Mayflower Pilgrims.
You're speaking at the conference on the model of pilgrim piety. You point out that the living tradition of the Pilgrims up to now has been understood within a narrative of the march of social progress, with an emphasis on freedom. And instead, you want to emphasize their practical religion in terms of faith and worship. And you go on to derive civic values from that source. So can you tell us about the piety of the Pilgrims and its effect on the society that developed?
For a number of years, I was on the board and most recently retired as the chair of the board of the Congregational Library in Boston. It's at 14 Beacon Street. It's a historic building. The Congregational Library on the second floor, collecting and preserving really all things congregational. And it's a very significant institution. As things are opening up again, want to invite people to come to Boston and visit the Congregational Library. From the street, you look at the front of the building, and there is a bas-relief of 4 aspects of Puritan life. And one of them is worship, and it represents the first worship service, Clark's Island, in December of 1620. And that is really the focus of my talk and of my interest. The other figures on the front of the Congregational Library represent civil government, democracy, education, philanthropy, for social progress. And as I look back on the way 1620 was celebrated, really since the 150th in 1770, the focus has been on those social elements that derived from the Puritan and Pilgrim experience. So the alignment of religious freedom with civil liberty has been a major theme all the way through. And when you ask people about that, the legacy of the Mayflower Pilgrims, the things that come to mind most readily are the Mayflower Compact and freedom and rise of democracy, and the great John Robinson quote where he said that God has yet more light and truth to break forth. And that's almost always interpreted in relation to more light and truth in social progress. And of course, the end of that sentence gets typically lost, from God's holy word. And you know, in recent years, the whole legacy of Puritanism and Pilgrim experience has become much more complicated because of what might be called the dark side, or the blinders that they had, as we all have in any whatever historic period we happen to live in. But with the Native American experience, the African experience of slavery, and so it becomes much more complicated to talk about, to celebrate what was great and what was the lasting value and importance of the Pilgrims. So it just seems to me that the most important thing is to go to the root of what they actually were here to do. Their refugee and immigrant experience. What was driving that? And it was their desire, their need to worship and fellowship as they saw fit. So it's the spiritual experience that was at the heart. And the other legacies of, you might say, certainly the rise of democratic governance comes from congregational polity. There's no question about that, the influence there. There are other influences as well, but that can't be denied. And there is a great tradition of social reform that comes from our tradition. But at the heart, and this is what I think we can celebrate and learn from, is their piety, their spirituality, what it was that led them to leave Scrooby in England and make their way to Holland, and then eventually, because of circumstances that this audience probably is quite familiar with, to find their way to what becomes New England. So as I tried to explore this using primary documents and my really almost lifelong research in this area, but with a special focus on the writings now of the Mayflower Pilgrims, and John Robinson, who himself did not, of course, make the trip and died, unfortunately, before that could happen. What I've been able to hopefully create persuasively is what I call a model of Pilgrim piety. And that phrase is borrowed from the great John Winthrop sermon 10 years later, a model of Christian charity. As we look at this, really we might think about what are those marks of pilgrim piety or pilgrim spirituality. And some of the things that can be said really at the heart of the matter are that it was a spirituality of the laity, and this means that it was communal. As I always say, and this is, I don't use the term takeaway, I use the term bring along, that we can bring with us. The pilgrim piety was always personal, but never private, as a spirituality of the laity. And it was almost 10 years before there was a pastor in Plymouth. So it was lay-led and communal. They didn't leave England because of their personal religious beliefs. They had to leave England because they insisted on gathering together as a group for fellowship and worship. So always personal, never private, with worship at the heart. And you know, in this day and age, people, the term spirituality has replaced the term piety. But usually as that word is used in common parlance today, spirituality is a very vague term. It's very squishy. It can mean almost anything to anyone. And people who are, as they say, spiritual but not religious, and there are vast numbers in this category, maybe more than call themselves Christian these days. But to my mind, spiritual but not religious translates as spiritual but not committed. And in pilgrim piety, we find a spirituality that is specifically committed to a biblically based faith, Christ-centered faith. And in this light, we can get into the religious experience of the Mayflower Pilgrims. I'm especially interested in personal experience. The corporate side of things is much easier to trace, but how do you get to how people prayed? What was the language of prayer? And what I do in my talk, in my paper, at the very end, I try to reconstruct what that prayer might have sounded like. Of course, the Puritans had no use whatsoever for the Book of Common Prayer or printed prayers that were read in worship. Although prayer devotional manuals and the printed prayers of people from Christian history or from Christian leaders of the day could be read and studied for the benefit of personal prayer. So what I've done is I've found very prayerful language in the writings, the 1620 writings in letters of the leaders of the Pilgrim settlement, Robert Cushman, and along with Edward Winslow and William Bradford, who of course wrote the great history of Plymouth Plantation. And these letters appear in Of Plymouth Plantation, and also the writings of John Robinson. By lifting out some language, of prayerful language from their letters, their writings, and simply inserting the address to God, it becomes a prayer. And we have something that might have sounded very much like the prayers of the Pilgrims.